So welcome back to another episode of Next to Madison. On today's episode, it's a follow-up from last week's episode on the book Hidden Valley Road. I'm actually sitting down with one of the main subjects of the book to kind of hear her story and what her take was, and also to kind of add some things that unfortunately might have been left out of the book. So here with me today as my guest is actually my second cousin, Lindsay Mary Galvin Roush. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks, Madison. How are you?
I am good. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been a big week for you with all the press and Oprah's book club.
Yeah, that was quite the surprise for sure. I know everyone is just thrilled and had no idea that the book was going to bring so much attention. And we're glad because it's a disease that needs some exposure.
So let's get into that for people who aren't familiar with the book, or they didn't tune into the last episode. Kind of give us a brief summary of kind of your family and what made you guys significant to have this book written.
I'm the youngest of 12 children. I have 10 older brothers and 1 older sister, and 6 of my brothers became schizophrenic over the course of my childhood. So that's really the main focus of the book, is to help people understand the disease and how the world really needs more exposure to what the disease is about. I don't think a lot of people understand it very clearly.
Right. And when it was happening to your brothers, it was blamed on the mother. Is that correct?
Yeah, that there was a period where psychology was trying to figure out what the causes were, and psychologists opposed to psychiatrists believe it was something called the schizophrenic mother, which is a term used when it's based on something called the double bind theory, which, you tell the child to clean their room and then they clean their room and it's not good enough. Like they didn't quite get it right. Rather than going, great job, you really did a good job of cleaning your room, you'd be like, you cleaned your room, but you didn't, put your shoes in the right order or something, So a lot of moms that are perfectionists tend to say, great job, but what's that A- about, instead of an A.
Right. So was she a perfectionist?
Absolutely. Yeah, she was.
So how did she mentally deal with, because your mom was definitely somebody, and your father, your father was very accomplished and they had quite a social circle. How was she able to kind of mentally cope when this started happening?
My parents were intelligent. They were intellectuals. They read everything they could get their hands on. They really searched for answers. They ultimately ended up at National Institute of Mental Health in Washington. And my mom became an advocate. She really, and it was so funny because it was like she was living 2 different lives. On one hand, she had these social circles where she didn't tell anybody. And then on the other hand, she was advocating and fighting for her children and getting them proper care.
Right. So what did she ever tell you, like, what her first experience was when she started to notice that something was wrong? Was it your oldest brother, Donald?
It's funny because we all, and the medical records all show that it was Donald. But my mother swears that my brother Jim was before Donald, that she saw signs of something that she couldn't put her finger on. She describes it in his teen years that he just, she really was like, there's just something up with this kid that I just can't explain. And it's funny, Billy, your great-grandmother, saw the same thing and would express it to my mom. But often children, teenagers in particular, when this starts to happen to them, they hide it. They go to great lengths to hide what's happening to them. It's confusing, it's scary, it's manic highs and really depressive lows, and then the psychosis doesn't necessarily accompany that in the beginning. And if it's caught early now, it can be really well treated. with light medications. But yeah, my mom swears, and she really can't describe it. It's funny. She's tried. She's like, there was something wrong with Jim when he was a teenager. And that was her first experience.
And so,
So,
because it kind of seems like in the book it was described as like Donald was the first one that
and in terms of the medical records, that's accurate. He was the first one to be hospitalized, the first one to have a severe psychotic break. So.
Okay. And there's something in the book that describes a Thanksgiving. Do you have any memory of that, of kind of what happened?
You know, I think that I was removed from that situation before somebody turned the dining table over, because I don't have that memory of that specific evening. There are a lot of other evenings that I could tell you about, but that specific evening, I think I must have been too small, and I must have been removed from the room when Jim and Donald started fighting, which was very typical. They had severe sibling rivalry. I mean, just really intense, severe, very dysfunctional sibling rivalry.
Okay, so what were some of the other stories that might not have been included in the book that you remember?
There's one that comes much later that's a little more vivid, because I was probably older. So I have a stronger memory of it, of Peter bugging me, like all brothers do. I don't know what he was doing, but he was just bugging me. And I was like, Matt, get Peter to leave me alone, just your typical, sibling stuff. And they got into it, and I thought Matt was going to literally kill Peter. I mean, they ended up in a physical fight, and I felt responsible, because I had asked for help from one of them, and they got into a physical fight. And then, Matt was on top of Pete and just pummeling him, and I was terrified. And, this was at the point where Peter was sick, and I don't think Matt was yet. So.
Okay, so they didn't really go in order.
No, they didn't at all. Yeah, it was sort of all over. It was really random. Donald, and then Jim, and then Peter. So Peter was third, and he was really young, very young. And then Matthew, and then Joseph. So, and I guess Brian. It's funny, we've not, Bob, one of the things when the book came out, it was 6 schizophrenics. We all were like, okay, who's the 6th? We all weren't quite sure. But apparently Brian's medical records showed that he had been put on an antipsychotic right before he committed suicide. So.
Okay, gotcha.
And then none of us were aware of that.
Right. So
there's a lot that came out in the book that was new to us, that our family wasn't aware of. So.
What was some of those stories?
Oh, that my parents ran away and got married in Tijuana. None of us knew that.
Yeah, I thought they got married in Central Park at the Tavern on the Green.
They did. So Billy put my mom got pregnant. My dad was home on leave, and they were, 19, 20 years old, and she got pregnant. And Billy put her on a train. My dad was being stationed out of somewhere in Southern California. And when Billy found out my mom was pregnant, she put her on a train and sent her to my dad in California, and they went to Tijuana and got married, because that's what Billy's like, he's going off to war, and you need to be married when you have this child. And it was the times, and it was, you didn't have a child out of wedlock. And then my father's mother apparently insisted that they have a proper wedding in a church and a reception in New York. So we all only heard the New York wedding story. We never heard the Tijuana story. And it was your grandmother who told that story. Like, no one else knew it.
Oh, wow.
No one had, I know, isn't that funny?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different stories that nobody kind of knew. But do you recall like the mental kind of toll it took on your mom when all this was happening? Because she really like had this picturesque kind of family that she was building. And
yeah, I mean, they both, it was pretty typical of the times, it's like we went to church on Sunday, and we, put on our Sunday, and we had a big Sunday dinner, and, that was just the life they really wanted. They just wanted this. And there was a lot of pressure to perform. I think my parents had high expectations for their children in respect to particularly academic. Both my parents were academics, and they believed very strongly in higher education. And, so I think there was a lot of pressure because my dad's success in his career. I think sometimes young men really struggle with trying to live up to their dad's expectations. And I think that's common, whether it's in, a family as dysfunctional as ours with such a severe illness, or any family. I mean, you see it in a lot of young men that kind of crack, so to speak, in one way or another over the pressure to be as successful as their fathers.
Right. And so what did your grandfather do then?
He went to Georgetown, and he foreign service school, and I think there was also a lot of pressure from my mom for him to be successful, because they had come from a family of wealth. And so I think my mom put a lot of pressure on him to I think a lot of women drive men's careers in that way.
Right, especially in those times when they're the primary breadwinner.
Yeah, exactly.
So the book was so well done, but it's a lot of trauma. What were some of the joyous times that you remember?
Oh, thanks for asking that question.
Of course.
Bob only had 356 pages, so he couldn't fit everything in.
Yes.
But I think the things that the siblings, when we read it, were like, wow, it's all so dark, but we remember lots and lots of joyous times. And my dad was the vice president of Federation of the Rocky Mountain States, and it was a economic development organization that helped bring funding to the Western region for roads and bridges and, economic development. But part of that economic development was the arts and humanities. And he got to bring, he could go to Washington and lobby for funds to bring the arts and humanities to the Western region. So we spent a lot of time at the symphony and the ballet and the opera. And that was sort of the place where we got to escape. We got to go to Aspen in the summertime and be there with Ballet West and the Aspen Institute. And it was, very, very joyous. And the boys that weren't well were left in Colorado Springs. So we were given a break from them. And I think my parents often tried to give us a break from it. We went to Santa Fe a lot and stayed at the McKinney's Ranch in Pewaukee, which is right near the Opera House. My dad was involved with raising funds. The Opera House burned down at some point, and he was super involved with raising funds to rebuild the Opera House in Santa Fe. So we got to spend tons of time in Santa Fe when we were kids. And we got to stay at the McKinney's Ranch, was this gorgeous place.
Yeah.
And so those were really, really beautiful and joyous times. The opportunities we had through the arts were really pretty cool. And then we spent a lot of time playing tennis in the park. My mom, in the summertime, Sunday, we'd all get our tennis rackets and go play tennis. Or we spent a lot of time at the Air Force Academy Golf Club and Officers Club swimming and playing tennis, and my brothers playing golf, and all the hockey games. I mean, I think, we practically lived at the Broadmoor. My parents got us out to the ice rink, constantly. I mean, a few times a week at least, we were at the ice rink skating and or watching our brothers play ice hockey. So those memories are just fantastic. Lots of hockey games. So.
Right. And so because your first memory was of the traumatic thing of sexual abuse, how were you able to kind of put that to the side and really enjoy all these moments with your family?
Well, I think that survivors of sexual abuse are very skilled at pretending it's not happening.
Okay.
I think they compartmentalize the trauma because they have to find a way to get through life. So that child that's being abused at home has to get up and go to school in the morning. And so they put on their mask and they, forge forward because they know they have to survive somehow. What are the options, really? I mean,
right. And just so the listeners are aware, if they haven't, read the book yet.
Yeah, and I think lots of people have secrets that they go out into the world every day and go to their jobs and put on their mask and forge through, and sexual abuse survivors certainly are in that category.
Yeah. And this was happening to your older sister too, right?
Yes, apparently. That was not something that was exposed until we were in our early 20s, and I brought it to light, and then she in turn did as well.
So did that kind of bring you guys closer together in a way during that time?
I think my sister and I, from about our my mid to late teens, I think as children, we were children, and I wouldn't consider us to have been super close as children because she was 3 years older than I was. So she was busy off with her friends, and I was just the annoying little sister, that always wanted to tag along. But then somehow in our late teens, we realized that because of all of this, we really needed each other, and we started to get really close in our late teens through our 20s, where we really started to explore these issues and get psychological help for them together. We were both in turn starting to see therapists and get the help we needed.
So when your older sister was taken from the home by a family friend, kind of taken out of the environment, why did they just take her and not you?
Yeah, it's funny. I asked Nancy Gary that same question, and I think Bob has explored that question with Nancy as well. She didn't know about the sexual abuse at the time. Nancy didn't. She only knew about the schizophrenia, and they just felt I was too young. I mean, I was 10, and my sister was 13, and they just couldn't see taking a 10-year-old. I think in retrospect, hindsight's always 20/20. Nancy's like, had I known there was sexual abuse going on, I would have taken you as well. And I was so jealous. I mean, she got to live in a house with a swimming pool and, a big trampoline and a cook and a cleaning ladies and a nanny and a driver. And she got to fly around on a Lear jet and go to Mexico. And I was stuck at home with my schizophrenic brothers.
There's a point in the book where it kind of opens up, which I thought was such a funny story. Your older brother was driving you nuts, and he thought you were Mary, the mother of Jesus, right?
It drove me crazy. He always
Tell us
called me
about that story, because it was pretty funny.
Which one is that one? Is that where I'm pounding on the wall telling him to shut up, or I'm not sure which one that was.
Where you took him outside and tied him to a tree.
Oh, the one where what they opened the book with. Yeah. I was little. I must have been like 6 or 7 years old. And I don't know if you probably don't remember these movies because you're too young, but there were all these movies all the time about Moses parting the sea. And, there were all these sort of like biblical stories that were being made into films. And my mom loved watching them. And I think the one that I got the idea of burning at the stake was actually Mary, Queen of Scots. And they were these historic, it was probably Masterpiece Theater or something. And I thought, oh, wow, I could do that with Donald. Right. And so I invited him up on the hill, and, he just went along with it. He's so sweet, he just thought, okay, Mary's playing. He doesn't remember it. Donald doesn't remember it. But, and I just wanted him to go away. I wanted him to poof into thin air somehow. I didn't want to, so I got him up there and tied him up and put sticks at his feet, and he just stood there. And then I don't know what happened. I'm sure I didn't have access to matches. I'm sure my mom kept the matches hidden away. So I don't even remember. I think I got up there and I was like, okay, now what do I do? I think I was playing. I think it was to a large extent playing. But behind children's play is emotional things that are going on. And I really did want him to go away. He was embarrassing to me as a child.
Yeah.
Because the medications cause them to gesticulate, which you'll see when you're walking around the streets of New York and you see the homeless guy that's moving his hands, in funny ways. It's called gesticulation. And it's actually typically, if I'm correct, it's often caused a side effect of the medication. It's not the disease itself that's causing that. But there's medication that they've used for a long time called Prolixin that causes gesticulation. So he would do all these weird things. He's walking around talking to himself and gesticulating all the time. And as a child, I was like, oh, please stop it.
Right.
It was exhaustive. And he'd show up at my playground doing it.
Oh my gosh, that's embarrassing, but
Oh,
back
it was
now.
horrifying. And it's funny, my classmates remember it. I mean, I'm in touch with my classmates from grade school, and they certainly remember it. And I'd get home, and I'd be like, "Mom, Donald showed up at the playground again today."
Oh my gosh, because Donald's what, 20 years older than you are?
Uh-huh. Yeah. So he would have been in his, close to 30. He would have been 27 or so when I was 7. So,
Wow. And
yeah.
so I remember the house because were you born in the house on Hidden Valley Road?
hmm I was born at the Air Force Academy Hospital, but yeah, that was the home I grew up in. I
Oh,
never knew any other home.
how did you guys all fit in that house?
Good question. And Margaret and I had room to ourselves, which is really very strange. I think there were 4 bedrooms upstairs, and in the beginning, my sister and I shared a room. And then the 2 other bedrooms upstairs had 2 sets of bunk beds in each. So there were 8 boys in 2 bedrooms upstairs.
Wow.
Yeah, 2 sets of bunk beds. I actually just got rid of the last Ethan Allen. I'm sure Billy bought them for my mom. Ethan Allen bunk beds. They were awesome. My kids slept in them. And then downstairs were the 4 older boys, and it was just sort of a big rec room. They transformed the garage into kind of a great big rec room, and so were there 4 beds for the 4 older boys downstairs. But 2 of the boys at that point had gone off to college already.
Okay,
So
got it.
when I was born, Donald and Jim were in college,
So,
and John shortly.
okay, so Jim was the one that abused you.
Yes, he was
Was
the
he the
he
only?
was the yeah, yes, he
What
was
was
the only one.
what was his wife like, and how did she not
Oh,
catch on to this?
she was lovely. Kathy was she was like a second mom to me. I mean, she was a big reason that I would choose to go to their home on the weekends instead of stay at Hidden Valley, because she was just such a lovely, lovely person. Um, and she was, her son was my age, Jimmy. He's my age. And so we were best buddies, and I got to go hang out with him, and she'd take us to do fun things. And so, yeah, I don't know how she endured being married to Jim. I really don't. And I'm so glad that, I mean, it was really heartbreaking when they left, but they needed to leave. It was, she was trying to stay married to this person that had a mental illness, which I just can't imagine.
And do
Yeah.
you still talk to her?
I have been in touch with her when Margaret and I, in our 20s, I think I was about 25 or 6 when I reached back out to her. Hadn't seen her since I was 13. They had really run away and had to go into hiding because Jim was so volatile and so violent. And so we lost touch for a long time. They literally cut themselves off completely to, for safety reasons. For little Jim finally started to get between his mother and father as he was getting to be 13. He was, becoming a teenager, and he started to stand up to his father. And that's when Kathy realized that she needed to get him out of there. And I can't believe they lasted as long as they did, frankly.
Where did she
But
go?
then, yeah, we got back in touch in my 20s, and off and on, Jimmy came and lived in Boulder for a little while, and we'd hang out a little bit. But now they live in California, and I haven't seen him in a long time. But yeah, they're lightly in touch. I think Kathy got interviewed for the book. So.
Okay, right. So how did you ever hear how his son handled what his father was doing to you guys?
Yeah, I mean, Jimmy and I, when he moved back to Boulder, talked about it at length and how traumatizing it was for him. And I think it's had a pretty big impact on his life, as it would for any child who is born into that. I think he was removed from our family at age 13 and really never reconnected. We tried a little bit. He came to some family functions when he lived in Colorado, but I think it was just kind of too painful for him to come back and fully try to integrate into a family that still has this illness that, is there. And
Right. And so was he the only sibling of Jim's or
yeah,
only
he
child?
the only child. Yep. He's
Okay.
really the only child of one of the schizophrenics in the family.
Oh, so none of the other boys had kids.
No, none of the other schizophrenic boys. Yeah.
Okay. And did the ones that were sick, did they have relationships with women when
Early on, I think in their, early on in their lives, they did, all of them. But shortly, I mean, Jim's was the only one that he was married, and he, I guess Donald got married, but it was very brief. It didn't last long at all.
Okay.
But the rest of them did when they were in their early 20s, when they were stable. They were able to go back to having relationships with women, but then they would have another breakdown and it would fall apart. So, and often the opposite order, it would fall apart and then they have another psychotic break, which,
Right. Oh,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
just heartbreaking.
I
So,
know.
so you and your sister were sexually abused by Jim, one of the older
Mhm,
brothers, who is since deceased.
mhm.
But there was also other sexual abuse in
Yes.
the family. Can you
Mhm.
tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jim also abused the two youngest boys, Peter and Matthew. And I only say that, it's not in the book, but though that was something that both Peter and Matthew confided in me had happened to them. And then also the Catholic Church. And I think this isn't as big a part of the book because that story has been told so many times now, the whole Catholic Church sexual abuse story. But um, I, I believe that sexual abuse in our household originated by a priest that my parents were really good friends with named Father Freudenstein. And I believe he sexually abused my two older brothers. Donald has told my mother that that's what happened. That wasn't ever anything that Jim told my mom and dad, but we just sort of assume that that must have happened because it happened to Jim. I mean, to Donald, that it happened to Jim, and Jim in turn, which is very typical that when somebody has been abused as a child, they end up being an abuser.
Oh my God. And so what was your mother's reaction to that? Did she,
She left the church. My parents left the church. They never went back to the Catholic Church when they learned that. They were in their, I'm going to say they were in their 70s when Donald told them. It was when the whole Catholic Church thing, the whole story broke,
Mm-hmm.
and Donald came forward. And at that time, my parents didn't really pursue it with the church because they thought, who's going to believe him? He's schizophrenic. Do we really want to drag him through more pain? But if you watch the movie Spotlight, it really shines a light on those that were abused by the Catholic Church. There was a psychologist in the movie. I don't know if you remember, but there was a psychologist in the movie that was going to the Boston Globe constantly and saying, I've got patient after patient after patient that has been sexually abused by priests that are now hospitalized for mental illness. So I wonder if the trauma of being sexually abused is somehow a trigger for that genetic vulnerability that sexual childhood trauma can actually, you see the guys come home from Vietnam and become mentally ill. The trauma of war, the
Oh,
trauma of rape, the trauma of sexual abuse, head injury, the trauma of, the stress, the emotional stress that's caused by any psychological trauma, I think could be a trigger.
right. It's like an unbelievable story and it's so heartbreaking. It's just like how your parents dealt with that. Do you think your mom was a good mom and your dad? They were both good parents?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, obviously, no parent is perfect by
Right.
any means. I think they they really shunned psychology, which I understand why, because of the schizophrenic mother theory. My
Yeah.
parents were like, this is BS. Like, we are not responsible for this. There's no way. And it was the world of psychology that was telling my parents that. And so they turned their backs on psychology, and I think they didn't realize the benefits it could have for the well kids in particular. The well children that were having to grow up in this environment really needed therapists. But at the time, therapy was sort of, their generation really didn't believe in it. They thought it was, a bunch of malarkey, and that you needed to forgive and forget and move on and go see a priest and confess your sins or something. The church was really the psychological support for a lot of families, and still is for a lot of families.
Right. So let's talk about your dad, because
Mhm.
he's in the book and they talk about him, but he wasn't, because he was the primary source of income.
Mhm.
He wasn't around as much. Can you tell us about him and kind of his Air Force Academy and things of that sort?
Yeah, well, when I was a child, he had retired from the military. So he had left the military already, and he was working in Denver. So he
Mhm.
was commuting from North Colorado Springs to Denver every day for work. So he would leave at 5 in the morning and get home at 6 at night. And my mom we always had dinner on the table. I mean, and dinner table set, dinner on the table. And he would get home and we'd have our evenings, and my mom would have to talk to him about the troubles that the boys were having at school, and try to download to him what was going on with the kids, which I think is common in many households where there's a one income, um, you know, couple where mom stays home and dad goes to work. It's like, okay, well, what happened with the kids today? How was school? And so here she was having to tell him about these things that were happening at school. And um, I think he just didn't know what to make of it. I think they just didn't know what to make of it. And um, and I also think he used work to get away from it to a large degree. Which I think often men who are workaholics are doing it because they can't deal with the emotional stuff that has to go at home with raising children.
Right. So your mom really kind of took the brunt of the burden.
Absolutely, yeah. But then he had a stroke when I was 10, and he was home after that, but he was recovering from a massive stroke, and so my mom really was having to care for him in addition to caring for the boys that were ill. So
You think
she,
back of all the stuff your mother went through, and it's like, oh my God, how could
yeah, I mean, her strength was really unbelievable. I think had they gotten psychological help, that would have been of benefit to the well kids. Um, but
absolutely.
it just wasn't that generation's MO, you know?
Did you ever witness her break?
No, I never saw my parents fight. I never saw her break down. I mean, they were rocks because they presented that front. They were trying to be strong for the well kids. They didn't want to come
Yeah.
across as somehow, weak. They wanted to stay as, strong parents. I'm sure behind closed doors, there was plenty of tears, I'm sure plenty of tears. And later in her life, as she did to me as I became an adult, but as a child, no, she never broke down in front of me.
Wow. And how
Yeah.
was her relationship with her mother, Billy?
Um, I'm sure you've heard the stories, Billy was a difficult woman. She was very opinionated, and she, I think she created a environment of sibling rivalry as well. I think that's a trait that gets passed down in families that can be really unhealthy. And I think that Billy set Betty and my mom up for some pretty serious sibling rivalry. She would always compare um, Betty's family to our family. My mom always felt so inferior because Betty's family was perfect and our family was so screwed up.
Oh
Um,
my God.
so I think my mom, but Billy did everything she could to help my mom in terms of, providing, beautiful baby gifts and always any financial support that, my mom needed for anything. She was right there, Lord and Taylor clothes for the kids. And so, and ultimately in the end of her life, she came to live with my mother. I mean, and that was, because Betty had cared for her and Billy had been such a big part of their family all their lives. I mean, they lived near each other. They were she was in Trenton and they were in Princeton, and so
Mhm.
they saw her constantly. And towards the end of Billy's life, I think the family decided that it was kind of my mom's turn to take over
Okay. And
and care for her.
how was that for your mom? Because she was still taking care of the sick boys, right?
Yeah, Billy was there with my dad and the sick boys. Yep. And I don't know, they never really I mean, I saw their relationship as very matter of fact. You
Hmm.
know, they just had to move forward as best they could under the circumstances. And I'm sure, I would imagine that, my mom would cry to Billy about it. It's her mother, right? And
Yeah.
Billy would say, Margaret, pick yourself up and, you know, put on a good face and, get up and go. She would, I'm sure she supported my mom that way and in
Yeah.
telling her to quit feeling sorry for herself.
Right.
You know,
I mean, but she had
it's
every
important.
right to. It's just, oh,
Yeah, I know. I
it's
know.
such a heartbreaking thing. And
Yeah.
so she was out there. So um I remember hearing it, your mom always blamed your father in a way, thinking that
Hmm.
this
Yes.
came from him and it was his fault. But he had passed
Yeah.
away.
Hmm.
And what was her reaction when she found out that she was actually the carrier for the gene that caused schizophrenia?
That was very late in her life. That was something that I brought to her from Dr. Friedman.
Okay.
And, I think she was regretful for having blamed my father. And the reason she blamed my father was because one of his brothers has a schizophrenic son. So, it seemed natural that genetically it would have come from the Galvin side because his brother Clark had a schizophrenic son, my father's brother.
And,
Um, yeah, I know. I
but he
know.
didn't have that gene at all when they tested him.
Um, well, as Bob put it yesterday, it's the perfect cocktail. I mean, it's a combination of the genes. Yes, the SHANK2 gene, it has a genetic deformity in our family, but that's not the only reason. It's a combination of genes. There's many, like you said, I don't know how many um, genes that they've discovered play a part in schizophrenia.
Right.
So although, yes, the SHANK2 gene coming from my mother contributed enormously, it wasn't the only factor. So,
Okay.
but I think my mom was regretful that she had taken such a strong stance and said, this came from your family.
Right, because she didn't know and she didn't kind of have the research
Yeah,
to.
she made a big assumption. And I think that's common in families where there's mental illness. They're trying to look for someone to blame, and there just really isn't anyone to blame.
Right. Well, especially back then when it was so stigmatized and you couldn't really talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys all started getting tested, all the children,
Mm-hmm.
become a major part of medical research. So do the well children also have that gene, but it didn't manifest the same way as it did in the sick boys?
Well, I'm not sure, and that's really, I think Bob Kolker knows that information. Researchers don't like to, when you go in and you're doing research, you're a blind subject.
Right.
They're not, you're one of many, many people that are being tested. I mean, our family of 14 was tested, but we're in there with 30 other families. So, they're trying to find some commonality among all these families genetically. And the geneticists don't really like to talk about who has it and who doesn't, because as they've realized, there's no smoking gun, there's no one reason for it. And so none of us really know who has it and who doesn't, because that's not something Bob Friedman feels is important information for any of us. We're just contributing to a greater picture. So,
Right.
and I mean, I could go to Bob Friedman and say who has it and who doesn't, but in that world of research, that's really not something they like to share.
Right. And so how was it with you in like relationships? Because this was kind of a very heavy burden to kind of have to carry. And at what point did you share kind of your family situation and what had happened to you with potential suitors?
Um, I would say I eased them into it. It's like any relationship, as you get closer, you're willing to share more and more with the person that you're dating. You know, Obviously, anytime I brought somebody home, that was something I was, which were far and few between for obvious reasons. It's
Yeah.
pretty uncomfortable for people to try to interact with a schizophrenic. And so, and I was always met with enormous compassion by anyone I told about it. And curiosity. I mean, everyone was always like wanted to know more,
Right.
and were enthralled. But it definitely put a burden on anyone that I chose to be in a relationship with. And I really have to commend my husband of 30 years now, because he's lived this with me. I mean,
Yeah.
he, we met when I was 23, I think, and
Okay.
he's been by my side through this whole process, and he's had to endure my healing, my therapy, my and frankly, I think Margaret's husband and my husband are both a little sick of it. They're kind of like, can we move on and just have our lives and not be dealing with this still,
Yeah. Well, I'm sure
30
they
years
understand.
later?
So
Yeah,
how,
yeah, they do. But, it's hard for those. It affects, that's, I think, one thing that it doesn't just affect me. It affects my husband and my children. And that's why families back in the day, locked them up and threw away the key, was
yeah,
to quote unquote psychologically try to protect the rest of the family.
right. And so when you got married, I mean, did you have a fear that this could happen to your children?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And before Rick and I chose to have children, we had extensive genetic counseling to make that decision on whether we would choose to have children or not. So I
So,
recommend that to anybody that thinks there's any kind of bipolar or severe depression or schizophrenia or autism. That was the disease I was trying to think of earlier.
oh,
But
okay.
when a kid has autism, the well siblings, struggle with having to deal with their sibling that has autism.
Right, absolutely. So you said genetic counseling, not genetic testing?
Well, I think now you can get some. I'm not a scientist, and I'm not up on all the technology, but I do believe there is both testing and counseling combined, because there's no, you know, as Bob put it, smoking gun that you
Hmm.
can identify that would say, yes, in fact, you have the gene that will pass down schizophrenia. It ends up being more genetic counseling, because you're looking at your odds. It's rolling the dice, and your odds, increase with, in particular, if you have a parent, like my nephew Jimmy, who has a parent who's schizophrenic. It would be pretty unwise for him to have children. But when you have a sibling, you're not schizophrenic yourself, having children the chances are much less likely. So statistically, it goes down to almost the same percentage as the general public. So in the general public, I think 1% of the general public is schizophrenic. And don't quote my data, because I don't have the NIMH website in front of me, the National Institute for Mental Health. You can read all about the statistics and the
Yeah.
details of the data.
So out of your siblings that had children, yourself included, none of them have schizophrenia?
Nope, not to date. We have lots of little ones. We've got, I think, 13 great grandchildren. And I don't quote me on that. Maybe it's 13 grandchildren. I'm not sure how many great, but yeah, nobody.
Okay, so that's great. So
Yeah,
at
but
least
there's,
kind of,
they're still growing. I mean, so
so they think it can skip all the way down?
yeah, it can skip 5, 6 generations, which is in large part why people who may have had schizophrenia in their family back in the day, one, they don't even know about it,
Yeah.
because it was hidden. Families would hide it. They wouldn't tell their family that they had a schizophrenic uncle. They just pretended it didn't exist. And so that information didn't get passed down from generation to generation, which is why the Mormon church is super involved with genetic research, because they keep meticulous records and they don't hide anything.
Really? I did not know that at all.
Yeah, yeah. The Mormon church, they keep meticulous medical records of families so that you can look at how things get passed down. So it's interesting, super interesting.
Yeah. So was there any point when you had your kids that you felt fear or had anxiety that this could
Oh,
happen?
sure. When a 2-year-old has a temper tantrum in the grocery store, you're like, is this schizophrenia?
Well, right. It's normal, but because of your family and your
Yeah,
experience, it probably
yeah.
kind of shook you.
You become hypervigilant, you know, you become really super aware of everything. And that's not good for the kids, you know.
Right.
That's hard not to do.
Yeah. So the sick boys that are alive, there's how many are alive that are sick for?
Three.
Three.
Yep. Three have passed away and three are alive.
Okay. So how are they doing today?
Well, I actually was awoken by a call from Peakview Hospital in Colorado Springs. Matthew's been hospitalized for on and off over the last month, and they're transferring him to out of acute care today into what's a step down unit, which is a less intense, it's like going from ICU to a regular bed in a hospital. So, and he hasn't been really hospitalized in a really long time.
What
So
does he
this
have
has
to
been
go?
the last month. It's been very hard for schizophrenia.
So
Yeah. I mean, it's like, imagine if I'm trying to think of a disease where, you would get ill and need to be hospitalized. Um, so,
oh my
and he
God.
hasn't needed to be since he was 22 and he's, 60.
So is he in a
Yeah.
home as well? They're all in homes?
No, Matt's been living independently up until now. And we knew, that this was coming. We knew he eventually was going to need to be in a long-term care facility. Um, and honestly, if it wasn't for our family, he'd be on the street like most mentally ill people. Because to try to navigate our system of care, it is impossible for somebody that's mentally ill. There's just, it's really not, they don't have the cognitive function to be able to get the help they need themselves. They need people who can do it for them. And most of those people you see living on the streets with schizophrenia just don't have that help. They don't have family that helps get them into long-term care facilities. And so that's why they're homeless.
It's just so
That's why
heartbreaking.
our homeless population is so huge, because there's no system to get these people food and shelter.
Ugh,
And
it's just
an
heartbreaking.
unbelievably large percentage of them are schizophrenic. And they self-medicate with drugs and alcohol as opposed to pharmaceuticals, because the pharmaceuticals make them feel horrible. And the
Yeah.
side effects of these pharmaceuticals are horrible.
So do the boys, they know they're sick. Have they,
No,
oh, they don't.
no. I don't know.
A blessing and a curse.
There's a technical term for that, and I have to look it up. It's a big long name, where a schizophrenic has the ability to self-identify as a schizophrenic, and most of them do not have that ability. Their brain function doesn't give them the ability to self-reflect or have. So they just think, Matthew just thinks he's, you know, well, thinks he causes climate change, which is really interesting. When he's angry, there's hurricanes and forest fires, and so that's what the way Dr. Friedman described it, which is so interesting to me, is that they really reflect the underbelly of society. So whatever is going on in society that is not good, like our problems with our planet right now, or the virus, or Matt talks constantly about how there are too many vehicles on the road and the emissions are going to kill us all. They get kind of stuck or obsessed on these things in the world that are really overwhelmingly difficult for you and I to comprehend and deal with. Like, what can we as people do about climate change, right? So here the schizophrenic is like, I'm trying to warn you people, I'm going to keep creating more hurricanes until you quit driving around in cars, So, and they get fixated on these things, which is really interesting.
Okay, so they don't feel sorry for themselves at all.
Oh yeah, they do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they do. When they're lucid. So they're not, it's hard to explain. Sometimes they're in a psychotic state and sometimes they're very lucid. And when they're lucid, what breaks through is the sadness. I took Donald and Peter out to lunch in January, and we went to this Italian place, and, Michael was there, and we had a nice lunch, and, it was nice for Peter to get out and Don to get out of their nursing homes and get out into the world. And after lunch, Donald looked at me and he said, "Mary, thank you so much for continuing to come. It makes the pain go away."
Oh, I mean, how heartbreaking is that?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I just, yeah, it's heartbreaking. So they kind of, sometimes they have it. I mean, I think it's there. It's, I think it's underlying um, all the time for them. And maybe that is why it's easier for them to live in delusion, because then they're not having to deal with the reality of not having children and lives like the rest of the world. I mean, that comes through. My brother Matt will be like, you know, you guys don't care about me. You just live your lives in your fancy homes with your fancy cars and your lovely children and your husband. And, I'm just left to rot, is how, he'll put it and that's pretty lucid. I mean, if you ask me, that's pretty aware.
Mm-hmm.
And he'll be like, but I am not what this mental health stuff is. This schizophrenia is BS, So it's denial on one hand and sadness and frustration for them on the other. So,
Yeah. And what is the typical lifespan of a schizophrenia? Do you know?
somebody living with schizophrenia, lifespan is shortened by about 20 years.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you're
It's really more the product of the side effects of the medications.
okay.
Cause diabetes, cause obesity. The medications side effects are huge. And also self-care. I mean, I think they don't have the cognitive function to care for themselves well. And so everything in terms of diet or exercise, that all is non-existent for them. That's just not even on their radar.
Right. Oh my gosh. It's just
Yeah.
the whole thing's heartbreaking, but there really is, you've been so wonderful to them.
Well, I read a book recently that I really was great and so hopeful. It's called My Schizophrenias, and it's by a young gal in California, and it's really, really good. I highly recommend it. But she had in college, I think she was at Stanford, she started to become schizophrenic, but she was able to recognize what was happening to her while it was happening. And she was able to get help immediately. And the book is about her journey in getting that immediate intervention and now how she lives a pretty normal life. I would say living with schizophrenia for her has not been nearly as horrific as it was for my brothers, because the medications have improved. And if caught early, most people that have it can live. She's never had another psychotic break since.
Oh my,
So
wow. So they
she lives in fear of it, but the medication has worked for her. And so.
Have you reached out to her to try to?
I haven't. I should. Yeah.
You should, definitely
Yeah.
should. I'm sure she's going to pick up your book and probably find, a lot of warmth.
And, I hadn't really read a lot of books about schizophrenia before, because I just didn't, it's like I've lived it. I'm living it every day. I don't need to, when I read a book, I have to admit I'm looking for escapism. I'm not looking to, necessarily deal with my own reality every, minute. So.
Right. And how have your children handled this?
I think it's hard for them. I think, they have had to deal with their mom taking care of her brothers and not there as much for them as maybe I would be otherwise. Okay. My daughter's going into research for schizophrenia, and that's her career dream, is to be a researcher.
Wow.
She's just finishing her senior year in neuroscience, pre-med at CU. And my son is also looking at going into the profession through wilderness therapy. He went to wilderness therapy as a 15-year-old, and now he's interested in becoming a therapist for kids that are struggling.
So it's like through this, they were like, I want to help people like my uncles.
Yep. And Mimi would just be over the moon that both of them, she might on one hand say, oh, don't do it. And then on the other hand, she'd say, thank you,
Oh, I mean, it's amazing that
they, yeah, it's really, really cool. But it's definitely been hard for them. I made sure they knew their uncles that were schizophrenic. It was important to me to not for our family to break that shame and stigma was really important. And that burden, has fallen on not just them, but, my husband and my good friends have to listen to me complain about it all the time.
Yeah,
So,
rightfully so. I mean, a lot of people don't have the burden you've had to deal with.
yeah, yeah. And I probably should have tried to protect my kids from a little bit more than I did when they were young. I was so adamant on them knowing their uncles that maybe I was a little too gung-ho. I could have been a little not quite as heavy-handed with making sure that they were around them a lot, because my kids were around my schizophrenic brothers a lot when they were little. We would go down to Mimi's all the time to visit, so
Okay.
they were exposed to it.
Well, I mean, and that kind of led them on a path that is going to
I
affect
know, I
future
know. It's
generations.
catch 22, isn't it? Yeah.
It is. And now the researchers, through the years that they've kind of been working with your family, they've come up with some hope
Yeah.
for preventing this. Let's talk about
Yes. Yeah, that's really exciting. I mean, Kate and I, that's how really this whole book thing got, well, my sister has been working on it and trying to write it herself for many, 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 many years.
that.
And we've tried to collaborate from time to time, but I just, with my business and my kids, I wasn't able to dedicate as much time to it as she has been able to. But Kate and I went to New York for Bob Friedman's. He won a big international award in psychiatry through, I think it's the Behavioral Health Institute. And it was about choline, which is something that he recommends every woman, regardless of your family history, take in higher doses in utero than the recommended dose you get in your average prenatal vitamin. So brain development in utero he believes, can be affected enormously by choline. So
Wow.
then you can just buy it at the grocery store,
So,
just like the vitamin C.
what was I don't think I've ever heard of this supplement until you had
Hmm.
mentioned it, until it was brought up in the book as well. What was it primarily taken for in the past?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'd have to look that up. I'm
Yeah.
not sure. It's in eggs. I know that much. Bob
Okay.
Friedman's like, you'd have to eat like 10 eggs a day to get the level of choline you need.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's,
If choline is good for in utero brain development, can it
mhm.
also help prevent things like bipolar,
Yeah,
depression, anxiety?
maybe, maybe other things as well, ADD, ADHD,
Yeah.
any kind of, brain function, I would imagine. Um, it could be helpful for.
And what is the dose that pregnant women should be taking?
I should know this and I don't. But I can call Bob Friedman right after this and get back to you with that answer.
Yeah.
This breakthrough came after I had children, so I didn't take high doses of choline when I was pregnant with my kids. But now, anytime one of the grandkids becomes pregnant, we're like, Emily just had a baby, and Bria, Michael's daughter, just had a baby, and we're like, be sure you're taking your choline. They're like, we know, we know.
Right. So that must give them a little more peace of mind.
Yeah, I think so. Hopefully. I mean, it's not proven yet. We're really not going to know till those babies are in their 20s whether it was effective. So, and some of them are babies of schizophrenic moms, and some are babies of non-schizophrenic moms. So
Okay.
I don't know how many subjects Dr. Friedman has. And there's a lot of other theories going on out there around the genetics of schizophrenia. Every research lab, Dr. DeLisi is still, working on her theories, and it seems like every research lab is working on a different gene that they think is the answer. So,
Well, it's just fascinating. And it's, even though your family had such a heartbreaking story, it's kind of like you've helped save future generations.
yeah, I hope so. I mean, that would be my mom's. I think when we first started on this research path, um, that was my mom's dream, was that there would be it would be found, in our lifetime, and
Yeah.
maybe we'll see the effects of that. I mean, I don't think I will at 50. I think the long-term effects of prevention and possible cures are maybe in my kids' generation.
Yeah.
So,
And how great that they're going to have a hand in that.
Yeah, I know. It's really cool. So for all those research labs out there that need a kid, she's willing and able.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
she wants to take a couple years and work in a lab before she goes to graduate school. So
Oh, that's great. I mean,
yeah,
just
I know.
unbelievable. So let's finish up with this. What would you say? We'll kind of take it in two parts. What would you say to people that may be listening that have experienced sexual abuse and they just can't seem to cope or can't seem to kind of let it be known? What would be your advice to them?
My advice would be spend the money on therapy. It's expensive, I know. I wish our healthcare system would provide more psychological care for people, because I think long-term benefits are enormous for not just psychological health, but physical health. I think the stress of not getting help from a therapist is huge. I take Zoloft, I take an SSRI and have since I was 25. My therapist finally got me to take something for PTSD and the anxiety that is often triggered by being sexually abused.
Uh-huh.
So, there are answers out there for people that are struggling, getting therapy and perhaps medication. Certainly self-care, obviously all the things we all try to do for our mental health in terms of, meditation and exercise and, doing positive things in your life, whether it's art or gardening or whatever your hobbies are,
Yeah.
using those for working meditation. And yeah, reach out, tell people, don't be shy, don't be ashamed. It wasn't your fault. It was, you're not, that's the thing that children overcoming sexual abuse is recognizing that you're not to blame for it. You were a child. So
And have you forgiven Jim?
yeah, I have actually. I
Okay.
have. Isn't that strange?
I
I
mean,
know.
yeah,
It's yeah, I
just shows
have.
strength of who you are as a person.
Yeah, I mean, I recognize that he was tortured soul. I don't make mental illness is not an excuse for sexually abusing a child, but I think the mental illness was not the reason. I think he had been sexually abused and he was just doing what had happened to him. Um, so in a very sexual culture, I mean, I think our culture is, Playboy magazine and strippers and,
Yeah.
that was sort of the whole, the 1970s was disgusting in that way, objectifying women, and I was part of the Me Too movement before the Me Too movement even existed.
Right.
I told everybody about it, everyone. There's a book out there called The Courage to Heal, which is kind of a Bible for folks that are sexually abused. It's a workbook, kind
Okay.
of a self-help thing. And that's what I started with when I was 20. And it was very, very helpful. And then Siblings of Schizophrenics was the other book that I really recommend for any folks out there that have siblings that are schizophrenic. I think Tori wrote it. I'm not sure, but I found that book to be a very, very helpful book when I was in my 20s and starting to embark on the journey of healing from both the sexual abuse and being a sibling of a schizophrenic.
Well, I mean, it seems like you're doing really great now and you're just such an amazing person. I mean, it just shows how strong you are that
Thanks,
you
Madison.
deal with all this trauma and still not feel sorry for yourself and still,
Oh, I've had plenty of feeling sorry for myself. Don't worry. I'm,
rightfully so though, rightfully so.
yeah. But yeah, I mean, what choice do you have? Sort of like my mom,
Yeah.
what's the alternative?
Yeah.
To run away, which you can't blame folks for doing.
Right.
It's a choice each person has to make.
Yeah.
So,
No, absolutely. Well, I appreciate you talking with me and sharing your story.
you bet.
Kind of giving us a little more insight around the book. And again, you
Yeah.
guys, the book is called Hidden Valley Road by Robert Colker. It is on shelves now and available online.
And
Highly.
Oprah Book Club starts Monday. So that's on Apple TV, and you go to Apple TV and go to Oprah's Book Club, and it'll give you the instructions on how to get online every Monday from now until June, and be part of Oprah's Book Club, live and in real time.
Oh, how fun. That's just such a great thing. So thank you for sharing your story with the world.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anytime.
Yeah, this was really great.
Thank you for sharing it. More important.
Of course. Absolutely. My honor. And you guys at home, thank you, or on the road, thank you so much for listening to another episode of Next to Madison. We'll see you guys next time to find out who's next.
Hi, your host, Madison Malloy here. I just wanted to remind you guys to please follow the show on social media at Next to Madison. And if you have any questions or suggestions for the show, or you feel that you would be a great guest on the show and would love to be considered, please feel free to email me at nexttomadison@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on all podcast platforms. And I thank you again for listening.